I just turned 34 when my brother kicked me out of my own birthday party. They thought I was nothing but a freeloader, but what they didn't know was that I'd been quietly building a $39 million fortune. That night, all my years of enduring their contempt finally came to an end. Sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who deserve the biggest shock of their lives. My name is Rachel Monroe, and I should have known better than to expect anything different from my own family. The upscale restaurant in downtown Denver buzzed with the kind of energy that money creates crystal glasses clinking, soft jazz playing over conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes in Aspen. The merchant's table was Ethan's choice. Of course, everything always was. Even my own birthday dinner had to meet his standards, had to reflect well on the golden child of the Monroe family. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, surrounded by familiar faces that had grown increasingly cold over the years. Mom picked at her organic kale salad, occasionally glancing at me with that look, the one that said I should be grateful for even this much attention. Dad focused entirely on his dry-aged steak, nodding along to whatever Ethan was saying about his latest promotion at the marketing firm. "So, Rachel?" Ethan's voice cut through the ambient noise like a knife through silk. "Still working at that little nonprofit thing." The way he said little made my stomach clench. I managed a tight smile. "Community development isn't exactly little. Ethan, we've helped dozens of families find affordable housing this year." "Right, right." He waved his hand dismissively, his Rolex catching the candlelight. "But I mean, what's the actual salary there? Can't be much. Helping poor people and all?" The table fell silent. Even the couple at the neighboring table seemed to pause their conversation. Heat crawled up my neck as I felt every eye in our section turn toward us. "It's enough," I said quietly. "Come on, sis. We're all adults here." Ethan leaned back in his chair with that smirk I'd learned to hate over 34 years of being his sister. "Mom and Dad have been worried about you, living in that tiny apartment, never bringing anyone special around. When was the last time you even went on a date?" "Ethan, that's enough," Mom said, but her voice lacked any real conviction. She'd said the same thing when we were kids, right before letting him continue whatever torment he'd dreamed up. "No, seriously. Remember that guy? What was his name? The one who dumped you last spring. Derek David." "Daniel," I whispered. My hands clenched so tightly in my lap that my nails drew blood from my palms. "Right, Daniel. Even he could see you weren't going anywhere. Guy was smart to get out before—" "Before what?" The words escaped before I could stop them. Ethan's grin widened. "Before he got stuck supporting you forever. Let's face it, Rachel, you're 34, working for peanuts, and still acting like you're going to change the world. At some point, you have to grow up and face reality." The restaurant seemed to spin around me. The soft jazz became a roar in my ears. I could feel the stares of strangers burning into my skin, their whispered conversations painting me as the pathetic charity case being publicly dressed down by her successful brother. "Maybe," Ethan continued, his voice getting louder, emboldened by my silence, "it's time you stopped expecting other people to take care of you. Mom and Dad can't keep bailing you out forever." That was the lie that broke me. They hadn't given me a dime since college, but somehow the narrative had twisted into me being the burden, the one who couldn't make it on her own. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking. "I think I should go." "Oh, come on," Ethan laughed. Actually laughed. "Can't you take a little honest feedback? This is what family is for, right? To tell you the truth when no one else will." "The truth," I repeated, my voice barely audible. "Exactly. Look, we all love you, but someone needs to tell you that this whole saving the world phase needs to end. You're not 22 anymore. Find a real job. Find a man who can actually provide for you, and stop pretending you're something you're not." The final blow came when he raised his glass of $300 wine and announced to our section of the restaurant, "Here's to my little sister finally growing up and joining the real world." A few people actually chuckled. Others looked away uncomfortably. but the damage was done. I was the punchline to a joke I never knew I was part of. Get out! The words were so quiet I wasn't sure I'd actually spoken them until Ethan's face changed. What did you say? I said, get out. This is my birthday dinner, and I want you to leave. Your birthday dinner. Ethan's laugh was sharp and cruel. Who do you think is paying for this? Rachel, who made the reservation, who's going to pick up the $400 tab. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the jazz seemed to stop. That's what I thought, he said, settling back into his chair. So why don't you sit down and... No. I grabbed my purse, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I'm leaving. Enjoy your dinner. Rachel, honey. Mom finally spoke up, but it was too little, too late. Sit down. Ethan didn't mean... Yes, he did. I looked at each of them in turn. Mom with her perpetual disappointment, Dad with his willful blindness, and Ethan with his satisfied smirk. He meant every word. I walked through that restaurant feeling every pair of eyes follow me, hearing every whispered comment about the family drama they'd just witnessed. The valet brought my 10-year-old Honda Civic around while Ethan's BMW sat gleaming under the restaurant's lights. As I drove home through the Denver streets, tears finally came, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of rage. The favoritism didn't start when we were adults. It began in the cramped living room of our ranch house in Lakewood, where the smell of motor oil and disappointment seemed permanently embedded in the carpet fibers. Dad ran Monroe Auto Repair out of a converted garage behind our house, 3 bays, 2 lifts, and dreams that never quite materialized into the chain of shops he'd always talked about. Mom kept the books and answered phones from a folding table in the corner, her calculator clicking away while she tried to stretch every dollar until it screamed. Ethan was 7 when I was born, old enough to already be established as the prince of our little kingdom. I have memories of being 4 years old, bringing Dad my crayon drawings of flowers and rainbows, only to have him glance up from underneath whatever car he was fixing and grunt, "That's nice, honey," before immediately turning his attention back to Ethan, who was helping by handing him the wrong wrench. "Boys understand engines," Dad would say, as if it were a scientific fact. "It's in their nature." When Ethan brought home a C- on his 3rd grade math test, Mom hung it on the refrigerator next to my straight A's and said, "Look how hard your brother is working." When I scored the highest in my class on the state reading assessment, she shrugged and said, "Well, girls are naturally better at that stuff. It doesn't mean as much." The inequality became a background hum in our house, so constant I almost stopped noticing it. Almost. Ethan got new school clothes every fall while I wore hand-me-downs from our neighbor's daughter when he wanted to join Little League. Dad rearranged his work schedule to coach. When I wanted to take piano lessons, Mom sighed and said money was tight. Ethan's bedroom was painted whatever color he wanted, first red for his fire truck phase, then blue for his superhero obsession. My room stayed the same pale yellow from the day we moved in, because yellow is neutral and practical. High school was when the script really solidified. Ethan scraped by with C's and D's, but every minor achievement was treated like a Nobel Prize. When he managed to pass Algebra 2 on his 2nd try, they took him to dinner at Red Lobster. When I got accepted to 3 different universities with partial scholarships, Mom's first response was, "Well, that's what happens when you study all the time instead of having a social life." "College is expensive," Dad had said, sitting at our kitchen table with his coffee mug and a calculator. "Maybe you should think about community college first. Save us all some money." This was while Ethan was failing his senior year, and they were already talking about which state school might accept him with his 2.1 GPA and Dad's connections through the local Rotary Club. I worked 30 hours a week at the Dairy Queen all through junior and senior year, saving every penny for college while watching Ethan get a $20 allowance for doing nothing more than occasionally taking out the trash. When graduation came, I had saved enough to cover my first year at the University of Colorado, but barely. "See?" Mom had said. beaming at the neighbors who came to our graduation party, a cookout in our backyard with store-brand hot dogs and potato salad. Rachel's always been so independent. She doesn't need help like Ethan does. Independent. That was the code word they used to justify their neglect. I wasn't independent by choice. I was independent by necessity. Ethan, meanwhile, struggled through community college for 3 years before transferring to a 4-year school that Dad's friend owned. Every semester, when his grades came in barely above failing, there was always an excuse. The professors didn't understand his learning style. He was too creative for traditional education. He needed to find his passion. When I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business and economics, the celebration was a sheet cake from the grocery store and Mom saying, "Now you can get a nice stable job and find a good husband." When Ethan finally graduated 4 years later with a C- average, they threw him a party at the country club they couldn't afford, invited 50 people, and Dad gave a speech about how proud he was of his son, finally finding his way. The pattern never changed, not even when we became adults. Ethan's mediocre marketing job was treated like a Fortune 500 CEO position. His string of failed relationships were just him playing the field and knowing his worth. My career in community development was seen as a phase, something I'd grow out of when I got serious about my life. "Girls need security," Mom would say during our monthly phone calls. "Career is fine, but you need to think about your future. You need someone to take care of you." It never occurred to them that I might be taking care of myself just fine. It never occurred to them to ask. The most painful part wasn't the inequality itself, it was how they genuinely believed their narrative. In their minds, Ethan was the responsible one, the family pillar, the son who would carry on their legacy. I was the dreamer, the one who needed guidance, the daughter who would eventually come to her senses and settle down with a nice man who could provide for her. They had no idea that while they were propping up their golden boy and waiting for me to fail, I was quietly building something they couldn't even imagine. They had no idea that their irresponsible daughter had learned their most important lesson perfectly: the only person you can count on to take care of you is yourself. And after 34 years of being treated like the consolation prize in my own family, I was about to show them exactly how well I'd learned that lesson. The real irony was that my family's neglect had taught me the most valuable lesson of my life: how to be invisible while building an empire. It started during my senior year of college, in a cramped dorm room at 2:30 in the morning, when I should have been sleeping but was instead reading financial reports on my second-hand laptop. While my roommate dreamed about her upcoming spring break trip to Cancun, funded entirely by her parents, I was studying commercial real estate trends in emerging markets. The seed money came from an unexpected source, my grandmother's inheritance. When Grandma Rose died during my junior year, she left me $15,000 that my parents had no idea existed. They thought she was broke, living on Social Security in that tiny apartment near downtown. They never bothered to visit her enough to know that she'd been quietly investing her late husband's pension for 30 years. "Use this wisely, Rachel," her lawyer had told me, handing over the check. "Your grandmother specifically requested that your parents not be informed about this inheritance. She said you were the only one who would understand its value." $15,000 wasn't life-changing money by most standards, but to me, it was everything. Instead of paying off my student loans or buying a reliable car like any sensible person would do, I did something my family would have called crazy. I invested it all in a small commercial property in an overlooked part of Denver that I'd been researching for months. The building was nothing special: a rundown strip mall with a failing laundromat, a vacant storefront, and a struggling sandwich shop. But I'd noticed something everyone else had missed. The city's development plans showed a light rail extension coming through that area within 5 years. Property values were going to explode. I bought the building through a shell company I'd created called Mountain Vista Holdings, a name generic enough to mean nothing to anyone who might accidentally stumble across it. My parents thought I was working part-time at the campus library. They had no idea I was spending my weekends learning to read zoning maps and calculate cap rates. The first 2 years were brutal. I lived on ramen noodles and generic cereal. wore the same 3 business outfits to every meeting, and spent my nights after my day job at the community development nonprofit studying property management and commercial real estate law, Maya, my best friend from college and the only person who knew what I was really doing, thought I'd lost my mind. "You're 24 years old," she'd say, watching me review lease agreements instead of going out to bars like everyone else our age. "You should be dating and having fun, not playing landlord to a sandwich shop that can barely make rent." But Maya didn't understand what it felt like to grow up invisible. She didn't know what it was like to watch your family invest everything in someone else's potential while treating your dreams like hobbies. I wasn't playing landlord, I was building my escape route. The light rail extension was approved ahead of schedule. Within 3 years, my $15,000 investment had become worth $250,000. I sold the strip mall and immediately bought 3 more properties in different areas of the city, each one carefully researched and selected through the same methodical process. By the time I turned 28, Mountain Vista Holdings owned 7 commercial properties across Denver and Colorado Springs. By 30, it was 12. I'd learned to identify undervalued markets, to spot development trends before they became obvious, and most importantly, to keep my mouth shut about what I was building. My family still saw me as their charity case. They'd invite me to dinner and slip me $20 bills for groceries, while I sat there knowing I'd just closed on a $1 million office building acquisition. They'd worry about my ancient Honda Civic while I could have bought a Tesla with cash and still had enough left over to purchase their house. The secrecy became its own addiction. There was something intoxicating about sitting through family dinners where Ethan bragged about his $40,000 salary, while I calculated the monthly rental income from my portfolio, which had surpassed his annual earnings by the time I turned 29. Maya was the only person who witnessed the transformation. She'd come to my downtown apartment, a sleek 2-bedroom loft I'd bought in cash, but told everyone I was renting, and shake her head at the disconnect between my reality and my family's perception. "This is insane. Rachel," she'd said during one of our monthly wine nights, gesturing around the apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows and custom kitchen. "You're worth millions of dollars, and your mother still sends you care packages because she thinks you can't afford groceries." $8.7 million, I'd corrected her, as of last month's portfolio evaluation. "Which makes this even crazier. Why don't you just show them what you've accomplished?" The answer was complicated. Part of it was spite. I wanted to see how far they'd go with their assumptions, how deep their dismissal of me really ran. Part of it was protection as long as they thought I was broke. They couldn't expect anything from me financially. But mostly, it was momentum. The secret had become so big that revealing it would require admitting I'd been lying for over a decade. By my 32nd birthday, Mountain Vista Holdings had expanded beyond Colorado. I owned properties in Austin, Nashville, and Portland, all carefully selected markets where I could see the same patterns that had made me successful in Denver. My portfolio was worth $28 million, and I was pulling in over $2 million annually in rental income alone. I'd also learned to live in both worlds simultaneously. To my family, I was still struggling Rachel, the nonprofit worker who needed their concern and occasional financial help. To my business associates who knew me only through my property management company, I was a savvy investor with an eye for emerging markets. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting, but it was also liberating. I'd proven something to myself that I'd wondered about since childhood. I didn't need their approval or their help to succeed. I didn't need their recognition to be valuable. What I didn't realize was how much I still craved those things, despite having everything I'd thought would replace them. That realization would come later, sitting in my car outside that Denver restaurant, with tears of rage streaming down my face and 39 million reasons to never tolerate their disrespect again. The drive home from the restaurant felt like moving through water. Every traffic light, every turn, every familiar street corner passed in a haze of humiliation and fury. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white, and I could taste blood where I'd bitten my lip to keep from screaming in that dining room. I pulled into the underground garage of my building, a sleek glass tower in Lodo that my family had never bothered to visit, and sat in the silence for 10 minutes, watching the concrete walls and trying to process what had just happened. 34 years old, and I'd just been dressed down like a child in front of a restaurant full of strangers. 34 years old, and my own brother had questioned my right to exist at my own birthday dinner. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor felt endless. Each floor that passed was another layer of the life my family refused to see, the life where I belonged in buildings like this, where I owned buildings like this. My apartment was dark and quiet, the city lights of Denver spreading out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like scattered diamonds. I dropped my purse on the marble entryway table, a piece that cost more than Ethan made in 2 months, and walked straight to the bar cart near the living room window. I poured myself 3 fingers of the 18-year-old Macallan that Maya had given me for my last birthday, and stood looking out at the city I'd conquered in secret. Somewhere down there, probably in some strip mall bar, Ethan was celebrating his victory, probably telling his friends about how he'd finally told Rachel some hard truths about her pathetic life. My phone buzzed, a text from Mom. "Honey, you shouldn't have left like that. Ethan was just trying to help. He worries about you. We all do. You know we love you, right? Call me tomorrow and we'll talk." I stared at the message until the words blurred together. The casual dismissal of what had happened, the automatic defense of Ethan, the assumption that I was the one who needed to apologize, it was all so predictable, so perfectly in character, that I actually laughed out loud. The sound echoed off the high ceilings of my apartment, hollow and bitter. Another text came through, this one from Ethan himself. "Look, sis, maybe I came on a little strong tonight, but someone needs to tell you the truth. You can't keep living in fantasy land forever. Call me when you're ready to have a real conversation about your future." My future. As if he had any idea what my future looked like. As if he had any right to an opinion about choices I'd made while building something he couldn't even imagine. I walked to my home office, a room that took up half of the apartment's second floor, and opened my laptop. The Mountain Vista Holdings dashboard loaded, showing real-time updates on all my properties. The number at the bottom of the screen was $39.2 million. As of tonight's market close, that was my net worth. I scrolled through the portfolio, the office complex in Austin that I'd bought for $8 million and was now worth $12 million. The mixed-use development in Portland that generated $250,000 in monthly rental income. The warehouse conversion in Nashville that had tripled in value over 2 years. Each property represented months of research, careful negotiation, and strategic planning. Each success had been achieved while my family worried about whether I could afford my rent. I pulled up my bank statements next. The personal account that my family occasionally glimpsed when I paid for dinner showed a balance that would seem appropriate for someone with my supposed income. What they didn't know about was the investment account, the money market funds, or the offshore accounts that held the majority of my liquid assets. If I wanted to, I could buy Ethan's house cash and still have enough left over to purchase the restaurant where he'd humiliated me tonight. I opened a bottle of wine, a $200 Burgundy that I'd been saving for a special occasion, and sat in my leather desk chair, staring at the numbers on my screen. All of this success, all of this wealth, all of this proof that I was exactly the opposite of everything they believed about me. And for what? For the privilege of being treated like a failure at my own birthday dinner. For the honor of having my life choices mocked in public by someone who couldn't balance his own checkbook. For the joy of receiving concerned text messages about my fantasy land from people who had no idea what reality even looked like. Maya had been right all along. This secret had stopped being protection and had become a prison. I'd spent so much energy maintaining the illusion of struggling that I'd forgotten why I'd started the charade in the first place. The wine hit my empty stomach like liquid courage. I thought about calling Maya, but it was past 11:30. And besides, I already knew what she'd say. She'd been telling me for years to stop playing this game, to stop letting my family treat me like their charity project. "You don't owe them your small life," she'd said during our last conversation about this. You don't have to keep yourself small just to make them feel comfortable. But it was more than comfort. It was their entire worldview. In their minds, Ethan was the success story and I was the cautionary tale. He was the one with the real job, the one with prospects, the one who understood how the world worked. I was the dreamer, the one who needed guidance, the one who would eventually need to be saved from my own poor choices. Tomorrow, Mom would call and try to smooth things over. She'd make excuses for Ethan's behavior and suggest that maybe I should apologize for overreacting. Dad would stay silent, the way he always did when things got uncomfortable. And Ethan would go on believing that he'd done me some kind of favor by being honest about my failures. The cycle would continue, as it had for 34 years, with me absorbing their disappointment and carrying their assumptions about my inadequacy. But as I sat in my $1,000,000 apartment, looking at my $39 million portfolio, sipping wine that cost more than my family spent on groceries in a month, I realized something had shifted tonight. I was done being small for their comfort. I was done hiding my success to protect their feelings. I was done letting them define my worth based on their limited understanding of my life. It was time to burn it all down. The planning began at 6:15 the next morning, before the wine had fully cleared my system and before I could second-guess the decision I'd made in the dark hours of my apartment. I started with coffee and a legal pad, sitting at my kitchen island as Denver woke up outside my windows. The first list was simple every way my family was financially connected to me without knowing it. The second list was longer every assumption they'd made about my life that I was about to shatter. Ethan's house was the biggest revelation waiting to happen. 3 years ago, when he'd gotten divorced and needed to buy out his ex-wife's half of their suburban ranch, he'd been denied for a mortgage. His credit was shot from overspending and missed payments. His income was too low, and his debt-to-income ratio was a disaster. But he'd found a private lender through a friend, a lender who turned out to be one of Mountain Vista Holdings' subsidiary companies. I'd structured the loan through so many layers of corporate entities that even my own property manager didn't know the ultimate source of the funding. To Ethan, it was just good luck and connections. To me, it was a $30,000 monthly payment flowing directly into my accounts. Mom and Dad's financial situation was more subtle, but equally tied to my hidden success. The credit card they used for emergencies, the one that never seemed to have a limit no matter how much they put on it, was backed by a line of credit I'd secured for them 3 years ago. When Dad's shop had needed new equipment, the business loan he'd celebrated getting had come from a fund I'd established specifically for small business development in their area. They thought they were independent. They thought they were making it on their own through hard work and smart financial management. They had no idea their safety net had a name. And that name was the daughter they pitied. By 8:30, I had a complete audit of their financial dependencies. By 9, I was on the phone with my attorney. Sarah, I need to restructure some holdings and dissolve several financial arrangements, I told her, pacing around my office in my silk pajamas and cashmere robe, an outfit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Sarah Williams had been handling my legal affairs for 5 years, ever since Mountain Vista Holdings had grown large enough to need serious legal protection. She was sharp, discreet, and expensive, exactly what I needed for what I was planning. "How quickly are we talking about?" she asked. "Immediately. I want everything unwound by the end of next week." "Rachel, some of these arrangements have early termination penalties. The Lakewood property loan alone will cost you—" "I don't care about the penalties," I interrupted. "I want them all severed, clean breaks, legal notifications, everything by the book." There was a pause. Can I ask what prompted this decision? I thought about Ethan's smirk, about the strangers in that restaurant watching my humiliation, about 34 years of being treated like the family disappointment. Let's just say it's time for some people to understand the actual value of what they've been dismissing. The next call was to Maya, who picked up on the first ring despite the early hour. "Please tell me you're calling to say you finally told them off," she said without preamble. "Better. I'm planning the nuclear option." "Oh, this should be good. Tell me everything." I gave her the summary while I got dressed, not in my usual nonprofit appropriate clothes, but in one of my real outfits. The black Armani suit that fit like it was made for me, because it was. The Louboutin heels that clicked against my marble floors with authority. The watch that was simple and elegant and cost more than most people's cars. "You're actually going to do it," Maya said when I finished explaining. "You're going to tell them." "I'm going to do more than tell them. I'm going to show them. Publicly." "Define publicly." I walked to my computer and started browsing event venues. I'm thinking the grand ballroom at the Brown Palace. Cocktail reception, maybe 150 people, business associates, property managers, city officials, people who know what Mountain Vista Holdings actually represents. "And your family?" "Well, we'll be invited as my guests. They'll think it's some kind of small networking event. Maybe a work appreciation dinner. They'll come expecting to see me fail at playing businesswoman." Maya was quiet for a moment. "This is either the most brilliant thing you've ever done or the most devastating." "Probably both." I spent the rest of the morning making calls. The venue was available for the following Saturday, exactly 1 week after my birthday humiliation. The caterer could handle a cocktail reception for 200 on short notice. The florist could create something elegant and expensive. The photographer could document everything. By noon, I had the framework of an event that would cost more than Ethan made in 6 months. The guest list took longer to compile. I started with my business contacts, the property managers, contractors, architects, and financial advisors who knew me as the successful owner of Mountain Vista Holdings. Then I added the people who'd been part of my rise, the bankers who'd approved my first commercial loans, the real estate agents who'd helped me find undervalued properties, the city planners who'd unwittingly provided me with development information. My family's names went at the bottom of the list, with a note to the event planner, VIP guests, front row seating for presentation. The presentation, that would be the centerpiece of the evening. Not just an announcement, but a complete unveiling of everything I'd built while they worried about my ability to afford groceries. I called Sarah back in the afternoon. "I need you to prepare a comprehensive portfolio presentation. Every property, every investment, every subsidiary company. I want charts, graphs, photos, everything that shows the scope of what Mountain Vista Holdings has become." "This sounds like you're preparing for a public offering." "Something like that. I also need all the documentation for the loans and credit arrangements we discussed this morning. I want copies of every contract, every payment record, every legal document that shows the connections." "Rachel, you're not planning to do anything inadvisable, are you?" I laughed, surprising myself with how genuine it sounded. "Sarah, I'm planning to do the most advisable thing I've ever done. I'm planning to stop hiding who I really am." That evening, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine and wrote the invitations by hand. Elegant cream cardstock, engraved with my real initials, not the ones from my fake small life, but the ones that belonged to the woman who owned $39 million in real estate. "For my business associates, you are cordially invited to an evening celebrating 10 years of Mountain Vista Holdings' success in transforming Denver's commercial landscape. For my family, you are invited to join me for a special dinner event. I have some exciting news to share about my career. Your presence would mean the world to me." The irony of that last line wasn't lost on me. Their presence would mean something. All right. It would mean front row seats to the destruction of every assumption they'd ever made about my life. As I sealed the envelopes, I thought about how different next Saturday would be from this past Saturday. 7 days ago, I'd been the pitied sister, the family disappointment, the woman who needed guidance and concern. In 7 days, I would be something else entirely. The grand ballroom at the Brown Palace Hotel looked like something from a fairy tale. If fairy tales were about revenge served at room temperature with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. I arrived at 6:30, an hour before the guests, wearing a midnight blue Valentino gown that had cost more than my parents' monthly mortgage. The event planner, a woman named Victoria who specialized in high-end corporate functions, was putting the finishing touches on the presentation setup. "The screens are all tested, the microphone is live, and your materials are loaded," she reported, checking items off her tablet. "Bar service begins at 7:30, presentation at 8:15. "Perfect." I walked to the front of the room, where a small stage had been set up with professional lighting and 2 large screens flanking a podium. Behind me, the ballroom stretched out in elegant splendor round tables draped in cream silk, centerpieces of white orchids and eucalyptus, and enough crystal glassware to stock a small restaurant. The first guests began arriving at 7:45. My business associates came in looking exactly as I'd expected: sharp suits, confident handshakes, the easy confidence of people who moved serious money for a living. They knew me as Rachel Monroe, owner of Mountain Vista Holdings, the woman who'd quietly assembled one of Denver's most impressive commercial real estate portfolios. "Rachel, this is quite the production," said Marcus Webb, one of my commercial lenders. "What's the occasion?" 10-year anniversary, I replied smoothly. "Time to celebrate what we've all built together." By 8 o'clock, the ballroom was buzzing with the conversation of 160 people who represented the real side of my life, the side my family had never bothered to discover. Then they walked in. Mom came first, looking overwhelmed in her department store dress and clearly uncomfortable in a room full of people wearing clothes that cost more than her car. Dad followed, tugging at his tie, the same tie he wore to weddings and funerals, probably older than my real estate career. Ethan brought up the rear, and I had to give him credit. He at least looked like he belonged, even if his confidence was built on ignorance. They stood in the entrance for a moment, scanning the room with expressions ranging from confusion to suspicion. I watched from across the ballroom as they tried to process what they were seeing. This wasn't the small work appreciation dinner they'd expected. This was something else entirely. "Rachel." Mom's voice was uncertain as she approached. "Honey, this is quite fancy. What kind of event is this?" "A celebration," I said, kissing her cheek and noting how she flinched slightly at the contact. "I'm so glad you could make it. Come, let me introduce you to some people." I guided them to their table front and center, exactly as I'd planned, and made a few strategic introductions. I watched Ethan's face as I casually mentioned that Marcus had handled several of my property acquisitions. Watched Dad's confusion when I introduced the city planning director as someone who's been instrumental in my development projects. "Development projects," Mom whispered as we sat down. "Rachel, what exactly do you do at that nonprofit?" "We'll get to that," I promised. At 8:15, Victoria dimmed the lights and introduced me as the visionary behind one of Colorado's most successful privately held real estate companies. The ballroom fell quiet as I walked to the podium, my heels clicking against the marble floor with a confidence I'd been hiding for over a decade. I looked out at the audience, 160 faces, but only 3 that mattered in this moment. Mom, Dad, and Ethan sat frozen in their chairs, still trying to process the disconnect between their expectations and reality. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me tonight to celebrate 10 years of Mountain Vista Holdings." The first slide appeared on the screens behind me, the company logo and a tagline that read, "Transforming Communities Through Strategic Investment." When I founded this company a decade ago, I had $15,000 and a vision for what Denver could become. The next slide showed a timeline of my acquisitions, property by property, year by year. Tonight, I want to share with you not just what we've accomplished, but how we've redefined what success looks like in commercial real estate. I clicked to the next slide, a map of Denver with pins marking every property I owned. The room murmured appreciatively. Even my business associates were seeing the full scope for the first time. 37 properties across 4 states, 12.4 million square feet of commercial space, over 200 businesses and organizations calling our buildings home. Another click, and a current portfolio valuation of $39.2 million. The number hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. I could see my family's faces in the front row, Dad's mouth actually hanging open, Mom's hands pressed to her chest, Ethan's face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that looked like panic. But numbers only tell part of the story, I continued, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. The real story is about vision, about seeing potential where others see problems, about building something significant while others question whether you can handle basic responsibilities. Another slide photographs of my properties, before and after renovations. Abandoned warehouses transformed into thriving office complexes, run-down strip malls reimagined as community centers. Each image represented months of work, millions of dollars, and decisions made while my family worried about my rent money. Success isn't always visible, I said, looking directly at my family's table. Sometimes the most significant achievements happen quietly, behind the scenes, while the people who matter most to you remain completely unaware of what you're capable of. The room was dead silent now. My business associates were beginning to understand that this wasn't just a company celebration. This was something more personal, more raw. Mountain Vista Holdings has been successful beyond my wildest dreams. But tonight isn't just about celebrating what we've built. It's about honesty. It's about showing the people who've shaped my life exactly who I've become, with or without their support. I clicked to the final slide, a simple statement in elegant font. Thank you for 10 years of believing in my vision even when I was the only one who could see it. The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous ovation. 160 people rose to their feet, celebrating a success story they'd just learned was far bigger than any of them had imagined. But I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at 3 people who remained seated, staring at me like I'd just announced I was an alien from another planet. For the first time in 34 years, my family was seeing me exactly as I was, not the struggling nonprofit worker they'd pitied, not the failure they'd worried about, but the woman who'd built an empire while they dismissed her potential. The woman who'd been successful beyond their ability to imagine, let alone achieve. The woman they'd never bothered to actually know. The applause died down, but I remained at the podium. The night wasn't over. In fact, the real presentation was just beginning. Before we move to the reception, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system, I have one more announcement to make. This one is more personal. The room settled back into silence. My family sat frozen in their chairs, looking like deer caught in headlights. Ethan's face had gone pale, and I could see him trying to process the mathematical impossibility of his struggling sister owning nearly $40 million in real estate. Success often requires difficult decisions, I continued, pulling out 3 sealed envelopes from the podium. Tonight, I'm making some of those decisions public. I stepped down from the stage and walked directly to my family's table. Every eye in the ballroom followed me, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be significant. Mom, Dad, Ethan, I said, placing an envelope in front of each of them. These contain some information that I think you'll find illuminating. Mom's hands trembled as she opened her envelope. Dad fumbled with his, nearly dropping it twice. Ethan ripped his open with the aggressive impatience I remembered from childhood. I returned to the microphone while they read, giving them time to absorb what I'd prepared for them. Mom's envelope contained a complete accounting of every financial assistance I'd provided over the past 5 years, the credit line that had kept their business afloat, the emergency fund that had covered Dad's medical bills when his insurance fell short, the lucky break loan that had allowed them to renovate their house. Total value $430,000. Dad's envelope held documentation for the business development grant that had funded his shop's expansion, the equipment leasing program that had upgraded his tools, and the small business loan that had allowed him to hire his first employee. All of it traced back to funds I'd established through Mountain Vista Holdings. Total value $620,000. Ethan's envelope was the most devastating. Complete loan documentation for his house, showing that Mountain Vista Holdings was the primary lender. Payment records showing 36 months of mortgage payments flowing directly into my accounts. And a formal notice of loan termination, effective immediately. requiring full repayment within 30 days. As you can see from those documents, I said into the microphone, my voice echoing off the ballroom's ornate ceiling. My family has been the beneficiary of significant financial support over the years, support that came from the woman they believed was too irresponsible to manage her own life. The room was electric with tension. My business associates were beginning to understand the full scope of what they were witnessing, not just a company celebration, but a reckoning years in the making. Ethan shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "This is insane," he said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Rachel, what the hell is this?" "This," I replied calmly, "is honesty, something our family has been lacking for quite some time." "You can't just," he started, then stopped, apparently realizing he was arguing with his sister in front of a ballroom full of strangers. "We need to talk about this privately." "Why?" I asked, genuinely curious. "You had no problem discussing my failures publicly last week. Why should my successes be treated any differently?" Mom was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face as she stared at the documents in front of her. Dad looked like he'd aged 10 years in the span of 5 minutes. "I don't understand," Mom whispered, but the microphone picked it up. "How is this possible? You work at a nonprofit. You drive that old car. You live in that tiny apartment." "I work at a nonprofit because I choose to," I corrected. "I drive that car because I'm not interested in impressing people who've already decided what they think of me. And I don't live in a tiny apartment, I live in a 3,000 square foot penthouse downtown. You've just never bothered to visit." The truth of that statement hung in the air like a physical presence. In 10 years of success, in a decade of building wealth that dwarfed anything our family had ever imagined, they had never once asked to see where I lived. They had never once shown curiosity about my actual life. "But why didn't you tell us?" Dad asked, his voice barely audible. "Because," I said, looking directly at him, "you never asked. In 34 years, not one of you has ever asked me what I was capable of. You decided when I was young what my limitations were, and you never questioned those assumptions." I walked back to the microphone for my final statement. "As of tomorrow morning, all financial arrangements between my family and Mountain Vista Holdings will be terminated. The loans, the credit lines, the grants, the guarantees, everything ends. You'll receive formal documentation through your attorneys by Wednesday." Ethan stood again, his face flushed with anger and panic. "You can't do this. That house loan, I can't pay that off in 30 days. Where am I supposed to get $400,000? "I imagine you'll figure it out," I replied coolly. "After all, you're the responsible one in the family, the one with the real job and the practical understanding of how the world works. Surely someone with your capabilities can manage a simple refinancing." The sarcasm in my voice was unmistakable, and it hit its target. Ethan's confident facade crumbled completely, replaced by the desperate realization that his comfortable life had been built on the foundation of his failure sister's secret generosity. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced to the room, "I want to thank you all for being here tonight to witness not just the celebration of Mountain Vista Holdings' success, but the beginning of its next chapter, a chapter built on authentic relationships and honest communication." I looked one final time at my family's table. As for those relationships that have been built on assumptions, dismissal, and conditional love, those end tonight. The silence that followed was absolute. 160 people sat motionless, having witnessed something that felt more like a public execution than a business presentation. "Please," I said, my voice softening slightly, "enjoy the reception. The bar is open, and I look forward to speaking with each of you about the exciting projects we have planned for the future." The crowd began to move and chatter resumed, but it was subdued, respectful of the magnitude of what had just occurred. I stepped down from the stage one final time, but instead of returning to my family's table, I walked toward the reception area where my real colleagues, the people who had supported my vision and believed in my capabilities, were waiting to congratulate me. Behind me! I could hear Ethan's voice rising in panic, Mom's quiet sobbing, and Dad's attempts to process a reality that contradicted everything he'd believed about his daughter. But for the first time in my adult life, their emotional reactions were no longer my responsibility to manage. I had chosen honesty over harmony, truth over family peace, and my own dignity over their comfort. And it felt like freedom. The reception continued around us, but my family existed in a bubble of shocked silence at their front row table. I could feel their stares as I moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and discussing future projects with people who had always known my worth. Ethan was the first to crack. "This is bullshit," he shouted, his voice cutting through the elegant chatter like a chainsaw through silk. Several conversations stopped as heads turned toward the commotion. You can't just destroy people's lives because you're having some kind of psychotic break. I excused myself from a conversation with a city council member and walked back to their table, my heels clicking with measured precision against the marble floor. "Lower your voice, Ethan," I said calmly. "You're embarrassing yourself." "I'm embarrassing myself." His laugh was sharp and desperate. "You just humiliated our entire family in front of a room full of strangers. What kind of sick revenge fantasy is this?" "This isn't revenge," I replied, my voice steady despite the tremor of anger building in my chest. "This is accountability. This is what happens when you spend 34 years treating someone like they're worthless, only to discover they're worth more than you could ever imagine." Mom reached for my arm. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks. "Rachel, please. We can talk about this. We can work this out as a family." I looked down at her hand on my sleeve, the same hand that had signed countless documents over the years accepting money from the daughter she pitied, never once questioning where the help was really coming from. "A family," I repeated slowly. "When exactly did we become a family? Mom, was it when you told me girls don't need education because they'll just get married? Was it when you hung Ethan's C- tests on the refrigerator next to my honor roll certificates and praised his effort? Or was it last week, when you watched your son humiliate me at my own birthday dinner and your only response was to tell me I should learn to take criticism better?" The nearby tables had gone quiet, guests pretending to focus on their champagne while obviously listening to every word. "That's not fair." Dad spoke for the first time since reading his envelope. "We always supported you. We always—" "You supported the version of me that fit your expectations," I interrupted. "The version that needed your help, your guidance, your concern. You never supported the real me because you never bothered to find out who that was." Ethan stepped closer, his face flushed with panic and rage. "So what? You're going to destroy my life to prove a point I have kids. Rachel, where am I supposed to live when you steal my house?" "I'm not stealing anything," I said, my voice like ice. "I'm simply ending a business arrangement with someone who has proven to be an unreliable partner. You've had 3 years to refinance that loan through conventional channels. The fact that you haven't suggests either poor financial planning or an inability to qualify for traditional lending. Neither of those problems is my responsibility to solve." "You're sick," he snarled. "This whole thing is sick. What kind of person hides money from their own family? What kind of sister lets her brother think he's successful when she's really pulling all the strings?" That's when something inside me finally snapped. What kind of brother publicly humiliates his sister at her birthday dinner?" I shot back, my voice rising for the first time all evening. "What kind of family spends 34 years making someone feel worthless and then acts shocked when that person stops caring about their approval?" The ballroom had gone almost completely silent now. Even the bartenders had stopped moving. "I didn't hide this money from you," I continued, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I built something extraordinary while you convinced yourselves I was a failure. I created wealth and success and stability while you worried about my ability to pay rent. I became everything you claimed I couldn't be, And I did it without a single word of encouragement from the people who were supposed to believe in me most. Mom was sobbing openly now. Dad stared at his hands, but Ethan wasn't finished. So this is it, he demanded. You're just going to cut us off, walk away from your own family because we didn't worship the ground you walk on. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I saw him clearly. Not the golden child, not the family favorite, not the successful brother I'd spent my life being compared to unfavorably. Just a mediocre man who had built his self-worth on the foundation of someone else's diminishment. No, Ethan, I said quietly. I'm walking away because you're not my family. Family supports each other. Family celebrates each other's successes. Family doesn't spend decades tearing someone down and then expect to benefit from their achievements. I turned to address all three of them one final time. You'll receive the formal documentation by Wednesday. All financial arrangements will be severed by the end of the month. From this point forward, you'll succeed or fail entirely on your own merits, which is apparently what you've believed was happening all along. I picked up my clutch from the table and straightened my shoulders. Enjoy the rest of your evening. The bar is open for another hour. As I walked toward the exit, the crowd parted before me like water. Some guests nodded respectfully, others looked away uncomfortably, but no one tried to stop me. Behind me, I could hear Ethan's voice rising again, but the words no longer mattered. I stepped out into the cool Denver night, breathed deeply, and realized that for the first time in my adult life, I felt completely free. The weight of their expectations, their limitations, their disappointment, all of it was gone. I had spent 34 years trying to earn love from people who were incapable of seeing my worth. Tonight, I had finally stopped trying. Maya was waiting by the valet stand, grinning like she'd just witnessed the greatest performance of all time. So, she said as my car was brought around, how does it feel to finally be yourself in front of the people who matter most? I thought about the question as I slipped the valet a $20 tip more money than my family used to think I had for groceries. It feels, I said, sliding into the driver's seat of my Tesla, the car I'd bought 6 months ago but had kept parked in my building's garage to maintain the illusion of struggling. Like I should have done this years ago. As I drove home through the glittering streets of the city I'd conquered in secret, I realized that revenge wasn't about destroying other people's lives. It was about finally, completely, unapologetically living your own. Thank you for listening to this story of family, expectations, and the price of hiding who you really are. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story? What would you have done in Rachel's situation? Please subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and let's connect with others who believe in the power of authentic success. Your engagement helps us bring more stories like this to life.